I suppose there's been a lot of change, a lot of what you might call innovation in terms of the role of the state and its position as a regulator and enforcer of work and employment regulation over the last 25 years in Britain. Broadly speaking, with deunionisation, decollectivisation of industrial relations in Britain since the 80s in particular, that provides the background for a range of new forms of state intervention within the sphere of labour market regulation. So this includes state regulation and enforcement of a national minimum wage from 1998 onwards, the establishment of an agency, the Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority, as it's called now, from 2004. Now, I mean, that organisation plays a role in enforcing legislation on modern slavery, regulating employment agencies and labour-only subcontractors, and came into being following various labour movement campaigns. Going back to 2004, there was a very high-profile incident in 2004 in Morecambe, which is a coastal town in the north of England, where 40 Chinese migrant workers who were picking shellfish on the sands of Morecambe Bay in the middle of the night were drowned and disappeared. So in the aftermath of that, there was labour movement pressure to develop this new agency to actually try and address some of this stuff. So that's some of the background in terms of the drivers for these new forms of regulation. So myself and Miguel have worked on various projects on these themes over the last decade or so. A couple of projects initially working with UCAT, the Construction Workers Union, as was, and then more recent work that we've been doing, which has been looking at three main enforcement agencies in Britain: the Health and Safety Executive, which is self-explanatory in terms of its name, the Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority, which I've mentioned, and also HMRC, I think that's Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, although it might be His Majesty now, the minimum wage enforcement function within them. So we've been looking at how those functions have evolved over time within this changing regulatory context, within various competing political priorities, looking at how they've engaged with unions, other agencies, employers in kind of co-producing regulation in the British context. On top of that, we've also been very interested in the nature of work for those tasked with enacting and enforcing employment regulation, how the employment relationship for inspectors and the work that we do, how it's been affected by these different political and organisational dynamics, and ultimately what that means for what amounts to direct state regulation of work and employment in Britain. So the HSE, I mean, I've mentioned already, I mean, it ultimately comes out of a so-called social contract in the mid-1970s in Britain. It was a kind of Labour Party developed initiative. I mean, I think, as has been the case with many of the New Deal era agencies in the US, it's been a kind of constant source of political attack, really. It gets attacked from the political right. There's a strange discourse in Britain where health and safety regulation is seen as this kind of slightly fussy, overly intrusive sort of means of stopping people being, free in various ways. I mean, freedom to get sick and injured at work. But it's a strange discourse that we see in a lot of the tabloid media and so forth, that health and safety has supposedly gone mad. But the resources that the Health and Safety Executive have declined significantly since 2010, where in Britain we've had this period of this ongoing, never-ending period of kind of public sector austerity and spending cuts and so forth. So the number of inspectors that the HSE has had fallen from just over 1,600 in 2010 to just over 1,000 in 2020. This is to regulate a labour market of around 35 million people. In terms of a minimum wage, since 2010, employers who underpay workers, breach national minimum wage regulations have been publicly named. We've heard a bit about this already in other contexts. This has always been a fairly weak instrument in a way. So employers complained to the government, and the naming of employers was suspended from 2018 to 2020 because employers didn't want to be named, and they kind of got their way on that. We have started to see increased fines for breaches of minimum wage regulation in Britain. So in some respects, it's complicated, but in some respects, you start to see a somewhat more assertive enforcement approach in some areas and a kind of less assertive enforcement approach in other ones at the same time. So the minimum wage regulation function has been strengthened, but it still only really seems to be making a fairly sort of limited impact. I mean, so in 2018, for example, some really useful research by the Resolution Foundation In 2018, the minimum wage in regulation function within HMRC identified just under 1,500 firms that were deemed to have underpaid the minimum wage. But we have this quite detailed data set, the annual survey of hours and earnings. And analysis of that indicated from 2018 that there were probably more like 11,000 firms which were actually underpaying the minimum wage. So it is a much more widespread problem than it's often assumed to be. Similarly, with a GLAA, it's done some, sort of really quite significant work in many respects in terms of recovering unpaid wages and holiday pay and so forth for workers deemed to be facing labour exploitation. But criminal charges relating to modern slavery legislation have remained very, very low. And there's only been one instance of charges being made following JLAA referrals to the Crown Prosecution Service between 2018 and 2020. So again, I mean, superficially, it looks like we have a far more interventionist regulatory approach, but you have to do an awful lot to actually get prosecuted, really. And the discourse on this is evolving. I mean, I've got in my notes here the short-lived Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, she's now Home Secretary again. This is what life is like in the failed state of Britain in 2022. Suella Braverman was our Home Secretary for about 5 weeks, and then she was forced to resign. And now we have a new Prime Minister that nobody was allowed to vote for, and he has reinstated Suella Braverman. She'd recently claimed that modern slavery legislation was being abused by migrant workers just so they were able to stay in the UK. So she's saying vulnerable migrants are basically pretending to be enslaved just so they can stay in Britain, which is really going through the looking glass, isn't it? Obviously kind of widespread problems during, COVID-19 in terms of workers deemed to be essential, people who were working through the pandemic and so forth. But we see a huge drop in terms of HSE activity in that sort of period. The government at the time was saying, oh, well, the Health and Safety Executive will ensure that workplaces remain safe. But in the first 6 months of a pandemic, they made just over 5,000 visits to British workplaces. That represented a 40% decline in inspection numbers compared to the same period in 2019. So if anything, most of the inspectors during that period were working from home, which is obviously of limited utility. So simultaneously, the state's more interventionist in some ways around minimum wages, regulating labour-only subcontractors, extreme forms of labour exploitation. But in the sphere of health and safety, the emphasis has been more on deregulation, reducing the coverage of regulatory oversight, reducing the presence and visibility of the state in that sort of area. So some of these difficulties in terms of enforcement come from the kind of highly bureaucratic and sometimes very kind of law enforcement and immigration regulatory cultures that exist within sections of the inspection workforce, which is problematic. So a kind of law enforcement approach, really, which obviously creates all kinds of problems if you're trying to build trust with kind of relatively vulnerable workforces. There's also kind of latent anti-unionism, I suppose, within the British state, which makes collaboration between unions and representatives of the workers being regulated very difficult to sustain. I mean, just one example, the standard trade union education courses on health and safety that are run in Britain by the Trade Union Congress, the Peak Level Union Federation, used to have guidance on, getting in touch with your local health and safety inspector and, having a kind of having their telephone number, being able to talk to them directly. All of that's gone, and it's now essentially a kind of triage system where you have to kind of write to an anonymous email address and then somebody might get back to you. So, I mean, those kinds of links have been really eroded over time. So just to come on to the second part of this, based on this particular experience, what might be next steps for advancing workplace justice? And I'm doing my utmost these days to try and not end every presentation I give on a sort of grim negative note. So I'll do my best. But there's a need when you're looking at these regulatory actors, we think, to look at the internal dimension of regulatory work itself when you're looking at how the state regulates employment and how the nature of this particular form of public sector employment that inspectors are subject to impacts on the capacity of the state and how it actually regulates abuses of employment standards. Inspectors are subject to new public management, performance management regimes, stagnating pay, and so forth. Many of them have left, as we, have in the examples Janice gave earlier. They've gone to work for private companies, have gone to work for consultancy firms, and so forth. So, I mean, there's a real kind of loss of knowledge, expertise, sector level knowledge amongst the inspection workforce, which, I mean, has really significant impacts. So I think, optimism's in short supply in Britain in 2022, as I say, but I think in terms of, we are keen to, Miguel and myself, to develop some of this work on health and safety and to, sort of try and do some further research on this, hopefully with some funding, if we manage to get it. But I mean, we're interested in health and safety in terms of the state of it in the post-pandemic period. And there are some kind of emerging issues here which are potentially quite positive. Some research by a colleague, Phil Taylor, at the University of Strathclyde, solely looking at Scotland, but looking at trade union education, identified during the pandemic that in Unison, the main public sector union alone, in the region of 400 or 500 or so new health and safety representatives had been trained and put into place in the public sector. They were overwhelmingly women. There's an increase there in terms of interest in health and safety, and workers actually stepping up to actually get more involved in it. And we'd really like to look at this in a bit more detail, because there may possibly be some small signs of optimism there, but let's not hold our breath anyway. Okay, well, yeah, with that, thank you. Thanks.